The giant cowboy had waited nearly 2 years to hear his daughter speak. So why did the first sound from her lips send a hot baking pan crashing against the stove? The pan struck iron with a sharp clang. Grace spun around, heat burning through her mitt, and found 6-year-old Nellie barefoot in the kitchen, tiny fingers twisted into her flour-dusted apron. Walter froze in the doorway as the child opened her mouth. What had finally broken her silence? "Stay with us and tell us where you're watching from." The wind struck Red Willow Ranch hard enough to make the kitchen windows jump in their frames. Grace Holloway looked up from the iron stove. For a moment, she listened. Nothing but Wyoming winter pressing against the house. Wind under the eaves. Snow brushing dry and sharp against the glass. Somewhere beyond the barn, a loose length of chain knocked twice against a gatepost. Grace turned back to the biscuits. "Almost," she murmured. She wrapped a folded flour sack around the hot pan handle and pulled the tray from the stove. The biscuits had risen high, their tops browned along the edges. Butter hissed where it had spilled onto the blackened pan. Behind her came a sound. Small. So small she almost mistook it for the fire settling. Grace stopped. The kitchen had been nearly empty a moment earlier. The ranch hands had finished supper and gone back to the bunkhouse. The coffee pot sat cooling on the rear corner of the stove. One kerosene lamp burned above the table, its yellow flame bending whenever the wind found another crack in the walls. Grace turned slowly. Nellie Mercer stood beside the table. The 6-year-old had come downstairs without shoes. Her white nightdress reached her ankles. Her dark hair hung loose around her face, and one bare foot rested on the braided rug, while the other touched the cold floorboards. "Nellie." Grace set the pan halfway onto the stove. "You'll freeze those little toes." Nellie didn't move. She was staring at Grace. Grace had learned not to ask what the child wanted. 5 weeks at Red Willow had taught her that much. Nellie would point if she needed water. She would touch the bread box if she was hungry. If she wanted her father, she usually went looking for him herself. But tonight, she did none of those things. She crossed the kitchen. 3 quiet steps. Then she caught a handful of Grace's apron. Grace looked down. Nellie's fingers had twisted the blue cotton so tightly that her knuckles had gone pale. "What is it, sweetheart?" The girl's lips parted. No sound came. Grace's breath caught. She knew that movement. She had seen it before. Not often. Never for long. A tiny working of the mouth when Nellie thought no one was paying attention. A breath shaped around something that refused to become a word. Grace had never mentioned it. Not even to Walter. Especially not to Walter. Nellie swallowed. Her fingers tightened. Grace lowered herself carefully until they were almost eye to eye. Her knees complained against the floorboards, but she ignored them. She did not tell Nellie to try. She did not say, "Speak." She simply waited. The wind hit the house again. The lamp chimney gave a faint rattle. Then Nellie made a sound. "Gee." Grace went perfectly still. The kitchen door opened behind them. Walter Mercer stepped inside carrying a saddle blanket, crusted white with snow. He had to duck slightly beneath the frame. At 6'6", Walter seemed too large for most rooms, but the effect was stronger in the kitchen. His shoulders nearly filled the doorway. Snow clung to his coat and the brim of his hat, and his beard was wet where his breath had frozen into it. He saw Grace kneeling. Then Nellie. He stopped. Nellie's eyes flicked toward him. For one terrible second, Grace thought the moment was gone, but the child's hand remained buried in her apron. Nellie looked back at Grace. Her mouth opened again. "Grace." The pan slipped. It struck the edge of the stove with a hard metallic clang. 3 biscuits rolled across the floor. Nobody reached for them. Walter's saddle blanket slid lower in his hand. Grace could hear him breathing. Nellie stared at her as though frightened by the sound of her own voice. Grace's eyes burned, but she did not reach for the child. Not yet. "Oh, Nellie," she whispered. Walter moved one step into the room. The floor creaked beneath his boot. Nellie turned. Grace watched Walter's face change. She had seen that face hard with exhaustion. She had seen it closed against insult, tight with worry over cattle, and softened by small things he thought nobody noticed. She had never seen it empty of every defense at once. His lips parted. "Nell." The girl looked at him. Walter dropped the saddle blanket. He did not seem to notice. Nellie released Grace's apron. Her small hand remained suspended between them for a moment before falling to her side. Walter took another step, then stopped himself. That was his habit with Nellie. He never rushed the last distance. He waited for her to decide it. Grace pressed one hand against the table and stood. Her heart was pounding hard enough to make her fingertips tremble. Walter looked at her. There were questions in his face. Too many for one room. Had Nellie spoken before? Why Grace? What had happened? What had Grace done? Grace could answer only one of them. "I didn't ask her," she said softly. Walter's eyes stayed on hers. "I know." Nellie suddenly bent down. She picked up one of the fallen biscuits. The ordinary little movement broke whatever spell had settled over the kitchen. Grace almost laughed. Instead, she took the biscuit gently from Nellie's hand. "That one's been on the floor." Nellie frowned. Grace reached for another from the tray. "This one hasn't." She broke it open. Steam curled between the halves. Grace spread a little butter across the middle and handed it to her. Nellie carried it to the table and climbed onto her usual chair, as if she had not just done something that had been prayed over, worried over, whispered about, and finally stopped being expected. Walter remained by the door. Grace began picking biscuits off the floor. After the second one, Walter crouched to help. His large hand reached for the same biscuit hers did. Their fingers touched. Neither moved. Walter looked at her. "What happened?" Grace withdrew her hand. She came in, took hold of my apron, and said my name. His jaw shifted. Grace knew him well enough now to understand that the fewer words Walter used, the more carefully he was holding himself together. He looked toward Nellie. The child sat chewing her biscuit, swinging one bare foot beneath the chair. Walter's gaze dropped to those feet. "You're barefoot." Nellie looked down as though this were new information. Walter crossed the room, lifted her easily from the chair, and set her on his forearm. Nellie did not protest. She rested against him, biscuits still in hand. Grace watched Walter close his eyes for the briefest moment when his daughter's cheek touched his shoulder. Then he opened them. "Bed." Nellie took another bite. Walter carried her toward the stairs. At the doorway, he stopped. He looked back at Grace. Whatever he wanted to say did not come. Grace understood that too. Some words needed more time than others. She nodded once. Walter returned the nod and disappeared into the dark hall with Nellie in his arms. Grace stood alone in the kitchen. The wind continued battering the ranch as though nothing had happened. She righted the fallen pan. She gathered the last biscuit from beneath the table. Then she noticed the place where Nellie's fingers had been. 5 small wrinkles remained in the apron cloth. Grace smoothed them with her palm. Grace. She could still hear it. 5 weeks earlier, she had arrived in Pine Ridge with $23, a carpetbag, and no reason to believe anyone in Wyoming would remember her name. She certainly had not expected a silent little girl to be the first person at Red Willow Ranch to say it like it mattered. And she had not yet met the giant cowboy who was about to hire her. 5 weeks earlier, Grace Holloway stepped down from the stage in Pine Ridge with a carpetbag in one hand and her mother's recipe ledger tucked beneath her arm. The November wind caught her skirt before both boots touched the ground. She planted her feet, waited for the gust to pass, then looked down the main street. Pine Ridge was not much to look at. A general store, a livery stable with one sagging corner, 2 saloons facing each other as if waiting for an argument, a hotel with faded green paint around the windows. Beyond the buildings, the road narrowed into pale dirt and climbed toward the dark line of the Bighorn foothills. Snow sat high on the mountains already. Down in town, the wagon ruts were frozen hard. Grace adjusted her glove around the carpetbag handle and started walking. She had $23.40 sewn between 2 layers of cloth inside her purse. 3 nights at the Prairie House boarding rooms would cost her $3 if she skipped breakfast. 4 if she did not. Grace intended to skip breakfast. She had done more difficult things. The Prairie House was above a saloon called the Blue Elk, and the woman who rented the rooms looked Grace over from head to boots before taking her money. Her name was Mrs. Pritchard. "You staying long? Depends on whether Pine Ridge needs a baker." Mrs. Pritchard's eyebrows lifted. "Plenty of women can bake. Plenty of men can shoe horses too," Grace said. "Still seems to be a blacksmith in town." Mrs. Pritchard stared at her for a second. Then the corner of her mouth moved. "Room 6. Wash water's at the end of the hall. Don't expect it hot after sundown." Grace took the key. The room was narrow enough that she could touch the bed and the washstand without taking a full step between them. A cracked pitcher sat in a basin. The mattress bowed in the middle. Frost had gathered along the inside edge of the window. Grace set her carpetbag on the bed. Then she placed the recipe ledger carefully on the washstand. The book had belonged to her mother. Its brown leather cover was worn pale at the corners, and half the pages were spotted with grease, flour, molasses, or something that had once boiled over in a kitchen decades ago. Grace opened it. Her mother's handwriting filled the first page. Biscuits for 12, apple butter, Sunday rolls, corn cakes. Under one recipe, in smaller writing, her mother had added, "Never hurry yeast and never argue with a fool before breakfast." Grace ran one finger beneath the sentence. "I could have used that advice last month," she murmured. She closed the book. By 9 the next morning, she had already been turned away from one kitchen. The Silver Crown Hotel manager barely glanced at her references. "We've got a girl. Your sign says you need a baker. We found someone." Grace looked past him. Through the swinging door, she could see an empty flour table, a cold oven, and a handwritten notice still pinned beside the register. "Baker wanted." She looked back at the manager. He did not blink. Grace folded her reference letter, put it in her pocket, and left. The second rejection came before noon. The Pine Ridge dining rooms occupied the front half of a long wooden building near the freight office. It smelled of coffee, frying onions, damp wool, and old bacon grease. The proprietor, Mr. Larkin, listened while Grace explained her experience at a railroad eating house outside North Platte. "You baked for trains?" "For passengers. 40 to 60 meals at a stop when the eastbound and westbound came close together." "Bread?" "Yes." "Pies?" "Yes." "Biscuits?" "Yes." "Can you keep accounts?" "Yes." He looked impressed until he finally looked directly at her. Not her face. The rest of her. His gaze moved over the broad line of her hips beneath her brown wool dress, the fullness of her arms, the way her coat fit snug across her middle. Grace had seen that look before. His expression changed. "Thing is," he said, rubbing one thumb over the edge of the counter, "customers expect a certain sort of woman in a dining room." "What sort?" He cleared his throat. "Pleasant." Grace waited. He became uncomfortable under the silence. Pleasant to look at. Grace's face did not change. Outside, a wagon rolled past the windows. The harness bells gave a soft jingle. Mr. Larkin tried to recover. Nothing personal. Of course not. Grace picked up her recipe ledger. He looked relieved. Then she said, "Do your customers eat the supper or the cook?" His mouth opened. Grace put on her gloves. "Good day, Mr. Larkin." She walked out before he found an answer. The wind had sharpened. She stood beneath the overhang for a moment and watched her own breath disappear. Her hands were steady. That irritated her. Sometimes she wished humiliation would do something simple. Make her cry. Make her shout. Give her some clean place to put it. Instead, it settled behind her ribs and became weight. She carried weight well. She always had. Grace walked toward the general store. A brass bell rang when she entered. The room was warm enough to fog her glasses for a moment. Shelves ran from floor to ceiling with coffee tins, lamp oil, rope, flour sacks, canned peaches, nails, tobacco, soap, and bolts of cloth. Behind the counter stood a gray-haired man with half-moon spectacles. "Afternoon. Afternoon." Grace set down 2 coins. "Half a pound of cheese, if you'll cut it." The man reached for the wheel. "You new in town?" "Yesterday." "Passing through?" "Trying not to." He gave her a quick glance but did not ask further. 2 ranch hands stood near the stove talking. Grace was not listening until one of them said, "Mercer's in trouble now." The other man snorted. "Mercer's always in trouble. Just too tall for anybody to see it. Cook walked out yesterday. Said he wasn't spending another winter feeding 25 men and getting cursed because the biscuits went cold during branding. Can't blame him. Mercer can. He got anybody lined up? Not unless he plans on cooking himself." That earned a laugh. Grace turned slightly. The storekeeper noticed. "Red Willow Ranch," he said. Grace looked at him. "What about it?" 8 miles north and west. Good spread. Hard country. You said they need a cook." The storekeeper paused with the knife against the cheese. "They need more than a cook most winters. I only asked about the one." He cut the cheese and wrapped it in brown paper. "Walter Mercer owns the place." Grace waited. The man's voice lowered. "Widower. That usually isn't part of a job description." "No." He folded the paper twice. "Biggest man you'll ever see, most likely. Doesn't talk unless there's a reason. Lost his wife coming on 2 years back." Grace took out her purse. The storekeeper did not hand over the cheese yet. "He's got a little girl, Nellie, 6 years old." Something in his tone changed. Grace looked up. "What about her? She doesn't speak." Grace waited for the rest. The man adjusted his spectacles. "Hasn't since her mother died." One of the ranch hands by the stove had gone quiet. The other stared into his coffee. Grace glanced between them. Then she looked back at the storekeeper. "And the cook, what?" "The cook who left. What did he make?" The old man blinked. "Beans. Beef. Biscuits when he felt charitable. Bread? Sometimes. Pies? Not unless the Lord himself asked." Grace took the wrapped cheese. "How much?" 8 cents. She paid. The storekeeper watched her put the package into her carpet bag. "You thinking of going out there?" "I'm thinking they have a kitchen." "They do. And 25 hungry men." "Near enough. And no baker." "That's true." Grace tucked the recipe ledger beneath her arm. "Then I don't see much left to think about." The old man's gaze moved briefly to the window. You won't catch Mercer at the ranch right now. He comes into town Thursdays for feed receipts and mail. Grace looked at the wall clock. 10 minutes past 1. What day is it? Thursday. Where would I find him? The storekeeper pointed toward the livery. If he hasn't already come in, he'll stable his horse there. Grace nodded. She opened the door. The wind pushed against it. Behind her, the storekeeper called, "Mrs.?" She turned. "Holloway. Mrs. Holloway. One more thing." "Yes?" "When you see Walter Mercer, don't let the size of him decide anything for you." Grace looked at the old man. What should decide it? He thought for a moment. What he does when he doesn't think anybody's watching. Grace held his gaze. Then she stepped outside. The road to the livery had frozen in ridges beneath wagon wheels. Grace walked carefully, her carpetbag bumping against her leg. She was halfway across the street when a dark horse appeared at the far end of town. The rider sat high in the saddle. Even at a distance, Grace could see he was unusually large. Broad shoulders beneath a black winter coat. Long legs. A hat pulled low against the wind. He rode without hurry. People moved aside before the horse reached them. Not fearfully, automatically. Grace stopped beside the hitching rail. The horse came closer. The rider lifted his head. For one brief moment, his eyes met hers across the frozen street. He did not look away. Neither did she. Then the enormous stranger turned his horse toward the livery. Grace tightened her grip on the carpetbag. "Well," she said under her breath, "that must be Walter Mercer." The horse stopped in front of the livery. Walter swung down with the ease of a man who had spent more years in a saddle than in any chair worth mentioning. Up close, he was even larger. Grace had expected tall. Pine Ridge had already made that clear. She had not expected the breadth of him. His black coat stretched across shoulders that looked built for lifting fence rails alone. His gloves were scarred at the palms. A pale line ran from beneath one ear toward his collar, old and nearly hidden by his beard. When he handed the reins to the stable boy, the boy had to tilt his head back to answer him. Walter said something low. The boy nodded. No wasted words. Grace watched from beside the hitching rail. Then Walter turned. His eyes found her again. Gray-blue this time, she decided. He looked at the carpetbag first, then the ledger beneath her arm, then back to her face. Grace wondered if he knew already. Small towns had a way of delivering news faster than horses. She crossed the road. "Mr. Mercer?" "Yes, ma'am." His voice was deep, but not harsh. "I hear you need a cook." His eyes shifted once toward the general store behind her. "I need someone who can feed men. That usually helps." Something changed at the corner of his mouth, not a smile. Close enough to notice. He removed one glove. Walter Mercer. Grace Holloway. His hand closed around hers carefully. That surprised her. A man that size could have swallowed her hand in his and made a point of it. He did not. His grip was firm and brief. "Cooked before?" "Railroad eating house near North Platte. Before that, hotel kitchen in Council Bluffs. Before that, my mother's kitchen, which was the most demanding of the three." He glanced at the ledger. "Recipes?" "Some." "Good ones?" "Most." There it was again. That nearly smile. Walter looked toward the livery office. "You have references?" Grace handed him 2 folded letters. He read them where he stood. Actually read them. Not a glance at the signatures. Not the sort of performance men sometimes made when they had already decided what they thought. His eyes moved line by line. The wind lifted the edge of one page. He pinned it down with his thumb. Grace waited. At last he folded them along the same creases and handed them back. What time can you have breakfast ready? What time do your men start? 5:30. Then breakfast is at 5. Bread every day? If the flour is decent. Biscuits? Yes. Trail food? Yes. 25 men when winter work starts. More if I bring extra hands in. Grace nodded. What do they eat now? Walter's expression went blank. That bad? Beans. She waited. Beef. She waited. Coffee. Bread. Sometimes. Grace tucked the letters back into her coat. Well, there's nowhere to go but up. Walter looked at her for a long second. Then he said, What wage? Grace named it. She deliberately chose the same amount she had earned in Nebraska. No apology in it. No discount because she needed the work. Walter nodded once. Done. Grace blinked. You're not going to bargain? No. Why not? You named the price. Most men would have turned that into a speech about fairness. Walter did not. He simply looked toward her carpetbag. That all you have? For now. I can take it. I can carry it. I didn't say you couldn't. The answer came so evenly that Grace almost laughed. Instead, she handed him the bag. He took it without triumph. That mattered. The general store door opened across the street. The old storekeeper leaned out. Mercer. Walter turned. Mail came in. Walter sighed once through his nose. I'll be 10 minutes. He looked at Grace. You can wait at the livery office. Stove's going. I'll wait here. Cold. So I've noticed. His eyes rested on her face 1 second longer than necessary. Then he nodded and crossed the street. Grace watched him go. The stable boy beside her said, He don't talk much. I gathered. Folks think he's mean. Is he? The boy considered. He fired a hand last spring for kicking a dog. Grace looked at him. The boy shrugged. Man said it wasn't his dog. Grace glanced toward the store. Walter was visible through the front window, bent over a stack of envelopes. That tells me more than mean, she said. By the time he returned, the sky had gone darker. He carried 3 feed receipts, a folded newspaper, and 1 small envelope that he slid into his coat pocket without opening. Grace noticed he handled that envelope more carefully than the rest. She did not ask. Walter led her to a wagon behind the livery. A little girl already sat beneath a buffalo robe on the bench. Grace knew immediately. Nellie. The child had dark hair cut just below her shoulders and solemn eyes, too old for 6. She watched Grace approach. No smile, no fear, just attention. Walter set Grace's carpetbag in the wagon bed and climbed up. Grace put 1 boot on the wheel hub. Before she could pull herself onto the high seat, Walter held out his hand. She hesitated. Only a moment. Then she took it. His hand closed around hers, and he gave just enough strength to steady her. No more. Once she was seated, he released her. Nellie, he said. The girl's eyes moved to him. This is Mrs. Holloway. She's going to work in the kitchen. Nellie looked back at Grace. Grace smiled lightly. Hello, Nellie. The girl said nothing. Walter's jaw tightened, almost too little to see. Grace looked away first, giving the child room. Walter gathered the reins. They rolled out of Pine Ridge just after 2. The town disappeared behind them within 20 minutes. The road climbed gradually toward the foothills. winding between open stretches of yellow grass and dark stands of pine. Frost clung to the shaded side of the wagon ruts. Farther west, the mountains rose blue and white against a low sky. The wagon bounced hard over a frozen wash. Nellie shifted under the buffalo robe. Walter looked down at once, not sharply, not with panic, just checking. Nellie reached one hand toward his sleeve. Walter slowed the team. He did not touch her until her fingers closed around his wrist. Then he laid his large hand over hers. The movement was so practiced that Grace knew they had done it many times. After the rough ground passed, Nellie let go. Walter let go, too. He never held on longer than she asked. Grace looked toward the mountains. She understood the storekeeper now. What he does when he doesn't think anybody's watching. They rode another mile before Walter spoke. One thing about the job. Grace turned. Nellie comes into the kitchen when she wants. All right. Don't ask her to talk. Grace's eyes flicked toward the child. Nellie was looking at the road. I won't. Don't tell her to try. I won't. Don't make a game of it. I said I won't. Walter looked at her. Grace held his gaze. Then he nodded. Good. The wagon rolled on. Grace waited until the silence had settled again. Anything else? Well, Walter thought. Ranch hands eat at 6 in the evening. Coffee's always on. Pantry locks stick when it's cold. Left oven door runs hotter than the right. Grace raised an eyebrow. That last one would have been useful to lead with. This time the smile arrived. Brief. So brief she might have imagined it. But Nellie saw it. Grace knew because the child looked from her father to Grace and then back again. The road narrowed near sundown. At the top of a rise, Red Willow Ranch finally came into view. The main house sat low and broad against the white-edged grassland, built of dark timber and stone. A barn stood to the west. Beyond it were corrals, bunkhouses, a blacksmith shed, smoke rising from 2 chimneys, and cattle gathered in a sheltered basin below. A red-painted gate marked the road. The paint was faded almost brown. Walter stopped the wagon. One of the gate hinges had sagged. He climbed down, lifted the heavy gate with one hand, and dragged it clear enough for the wagon. Grace watched. He caught her watching. What? Nothing. That wasn't nothing. I was deciding whether the stories about your size had been exaggerated. And? They weren't. He looked at her. She looked back. Then Walter shut the gate. By the time they reached the house, the light was nearly gone. A ranch hand came for the horses. Walter lifted Grace's carpet bag down. Grace stepped from the wagon on her own this time. Nellie stayed seated. Walter looked up at her. For several seconds, neither moved. Then Nellie held out both arms. Walter's whole posture changed. He lifted her against his chest, as though she weighed nothing. Her head settled beneath his chin. Grace turned toward the house before either of them saw her looking. Walter came up beside her. This is Red Willow. Grace looked at the stone chimney, then the kitchen window glowing faintly at the back. She tightened her fingers around her mother's recipe ledger. How bad is the kitchen? Walter opened the front door. Depends what you consider bad. Grace stepped inside. Mr. Mercer? I spent 3 years cooking beside a railroad boiler. He took off his hat. Then you'll probably survive. She glanced at him. That's the warmest welcome I've had in Wyoming. The almost smile returned, and for the first time since stepping off the stage in Pine Ridge, Grace had the strange feeling that she might have found a place where people cared less about how much room she occupied than what she could do once she was given some. By 4:30 the next morning, she was beginning to reconsider. The Red Willow kitchen was worse than Walter had suggested. The pantry door did stick in the cold. The left oven did run hotter than the right. One drawer had no handle. The coffee grinder sounded like a mule chewing nails, and somebody had stored a sack of onions beside the flour until both smelled faintly of each other. Grace stood in the middle of it, wearing her oldest apron, and stared. Then she rolled up her sleeves. The ranch hands came in at 5 expecting coffee, beans, and whatever remained from the night before. Instead, they found yeast biscuits steaming beneath a cloth, fried potatoes with onions, thick slices of salt pork, and a pot of coffee strong enough to wake a dead fence post. Conversation stopped. A lanky cowboy named Ben Foster lifted one biscuit and turned it over as if checking for fraud. Grace pointed her spoon at him. "Eat it or put it back." Ben took a bite. His eyes widened. Across the table, another man reached for 2. By 5:15, the biscuit basket was empty. Grace said nothing. She simply made a note in her mother's ledger. 25 men. Triple biscuit recipe. Walter entered last. He wore a heavy wool shirt, suspenders, and the expression of a man already halfway through the day's problems. Grace slid a mug toward him. He took one drink, stopped, looked at the coffee, then at her. "What?" "Nothing." "That's twice you've said nothing while clearly thinking something." Walter took another drink. "It's good." Grace nodded. "That wasn't painful, was it?" His eyes narrowed slightly. From the doorway came the smallest movement. Nellie stood there in a blue wool dress and stockings, one hand against the frame. Grace had not heard her arrive. Walter did. He always seemed to know where the child was. His shoulders softened, but he did not call her over. Grace turned back to the stove. Breakfast continued. Nellie stayed in the doorway until the cowboys had gone. Then she disappeared. The next afternoon, she came back. Grace was kneading bread. She looked up once, saw Nellie beside the door, and went on working. No questions. No invitations. The child's eyes followed Grace's hands. Push, fold, turn, flour, push, fold, turn. Grace pinched off a small piece of dough and placed it at the far end of the table. Then she returned to the main loaf. Nellie did not move. Grace did not look again. 10 minutes later, the dough was gone. The following afternoon, Grace did the same thing. This time she heard the faint scrape of a chair. She kept her eyes on the bread. Nellie climbed onto the seat and touched the dough with one finger. It stuck. The child pulled her hand away quickly. Grace dusted a little flour onto the table between them. Nellie watched. Then she rolled the dough through it. By the end of the week, they had developed a routine without ever agreeing to one. Grace baked. Nellie appeared. A little piece of dough waited on the corner of the table. Some days Nellie touched it. Some days she did not. Grace never asked why. On Saturday, Nellie began shaping it. Grace noticed only because the flour tin had gone quiet. The child had pressed 4 little legs beneath a crooked body and pinched up something that might have been ears. Grace looked at it. Then at Nellie. "A horse?" Nellie gave one small nod. "Good horse." Nellie studied the thing. One leg fell off. Grace did not smile. Hard winter. For the first time, Nellie's mouth twitched. It was not quite laughter. But Grace saw it. So did someone else. Walter was standing in the hallway with his coat over one arm. He had stopped without either of them hearing him. His eyes were on Nellie. Grace pretended not to notice him. She set the small dough horse on the edge of a baking sheet. "That one gets its own corner." Nellie touched the horse once before sliding down from the chair and leaving. Walter remained in the doorway. "You didn't ask her anything." Grace wiped flour from her hands. You told me not to. Most people forget. I don't. His gaze went to the baking sheet. Will it hold together? Probably not. Can you make it? I can make another horse. That isn't what I asked. Grace looked at him. There was something unexpectedly serious in his face. She glanced back at Nellie's crooked little animal. I can help this one. Walter nodded. That evening, Grace patched the weak leg with a sliver of dough and baked the horse separately after the bread was done. She expected Nellie to eat it the next morning. Instead, it vanished before breakfast. Grace assumed the girl had taken it. She learned otherwise during supper. The ranch hands had filled the long table, bringing cold air, leather, and the smell of horses into the dining room with them. Grace carried in a platter of beef and set it down. Ben Foster made room for her without being asked. Most of the men had adjusted quickly to the new kitchen. One had not. His name was Roy Keller. He was broad through the middle, older than the other hands, and seemed offended by any change he had not personally ordered. He watched Grace return with potatoes. You planning to feed all of us? He said. Or keep half that supper for yourself? A few forks stopped. Grace set the bowl down. She had heard better insults from men with less imagination. She reached for the gravy. Before she could answer, Walter stood. He had been at the end of the table going through a feed receipt. He folded the paper, walked to Roy, picked up Roy's plate. Roy stared at him. What are you doing? Walter carried the plate to the front door, opened it, set the plate on the porch rail. Cold wind swept through the room. Walter looked back at Roy. If you've got enough breath to insult the cook, you've got enough breath to eat outside. No one laughed. Roy looked around the table. Nobody met his eyes. He pushed back his chair and went out. Walter shut the door, returned to his seat, unfolded his receipt. Grace stood beside the gravy bowl. He did not look at her. That somehow made it easier. She finished serving supper. Later, when the dishes were washed and the ranch had gone quiet, Grace carried fresh linens upstairs. Nellie's bedroom door stood partly open. Grace meant only to pass. Then she saw the little horse. It sat on the bedside table wrapped carefully in a square of clean cloth, the crooked head poking out. Nellie was asleep beneath a patchwork quilt. Grace stepped closer. Someone had repaired one of the horse's ears after it broke. Not with dough, with a tiny piece of cotton thread. Grace stared. Behind her, a floorboard creaked. Walter stood at the end of the hall. He had been watching her look at it. Grace glanced at him. You wrapped it. He rested one shoulder against the wall. She wouldn't eat it. So you put it here. She put it here. Grace looked back at the horse. And the ear? Walter glanced toward Nellie. I fixed that. His hands could have covered half the bedside table. Grace imagined those fingers threading a needle small enough to mend a bread horse. She looked at him again. Walter seemed to realize what she was thinking. Don't. Don't what? Say anything. I wasn't going to. You were thinking loudly. Grace folded the linens against her chest. I'm beginning to understand why your ranch hands are afraid of you. His brow lowered. Because I sew? No. She stepped past him. Because you know when people are thinking. She had gone 3 steps when Walter spoke. Mrs. Holloway. Grace turned. He looked toward Nellie's room before meeting her eyes. Thank you. The words were quiet. No performance in them. Grace nodded once. Good night, Mr. Mercer. She continued down the hall. Behind her, Walter pulled Nellie's door almost closed, leaving the narrow crack of light the child preferred. And inside that room, beside the silent little girl, a crooked bread horse kept watch through the night. For the next several days, Red Willow settled into a rhythm Grace could almost trust. The mornings began before the stars faded. She lit the kitchen lamps, shook yesterday's ashes from the stove, fed split pine into the firebox, and waited for the iron to warm while coffee boiled in the battered blue pot. At 5, boots began sounding in the passage. At 5:30, the men were gone again. By 6, the kitchen belonged to Grace and whatever work the day required. Usually Nellie appeared sometime after 9. Never at the same minute. Never announcing herself. Grace would simply glance toward the doorway and find her there. Sometimes the girl brought the wooden spoon she had claimed as her own. Sometimes a rag doll missing one button eye. Once she arrived wearing one of Walter's gloves, the leather hanging nearly to her elbow. Grace looked at it. Nellie looked back. Good fit. The child's mouth twitched. That was how their days went. Nothing forced. Nothing named. One Wednesday afternoon, Grace decided to try an apple cake. She had been going through the pantry shelves and found a wooden crate of apples stored behind 2 sacks of oats. Most were wrinkled but sound. Beside them sat a small jar of cinnamon, nearly full. Grace smiled. That combination could make a poor kitchen smell rich. She peeled 4 apples, sliced them thin, and set a cast-iron pan near the stove while she mixed flour, eggs, butter, brown sugar, and a little sour milk. Nellie was sitting at the table rolling dough beneath both palms. Grace sprinkled cinnamon over the apples. The change in the room was immediate. Not dramatic. Just wrong. The wooden spoon stopped scraping. Grace looked up. Nellie had gone completely still. Her hands rested in the dough. Her eyes were fixed on the pan. "Nellie?" The child pushed back from the table. The chair legs dragged sharply across the floor. Grace did not move toward her. Nellie's face had gone pale. Her breathing came quick and shallow. Then she ran. The kitchen door struck the wall. Footsteps disappeared down the passage. Grace stood beside the stove with the cinnamon spoon in her hand. For several seconds she did nothing. Then she lifted the pan, carried it outside, and dumped the unfinished cake mixture into the scrap bucket. When she came back, she washed the pan thoroughly, then the spoon, then the knife. She opened the kitchen window despite the cold and let the November air carry the smell away. Walter came in 20 minutes later. He stopped almost immediately. The kitchen was colder than usual. "What happened?" Grace closed the window. "Nothing that needs handling right this minute." His gaze sharpened. "Nellie? She isn't hurt." Walter was already turning. She went upstairs. He stopped. Grace dried her hands. "Give her a little while." He looked at her. "What happened?" "I was making apple cake." Something in Walter's face changed. Grace saw it before he could hide it. "Cinnamon?" "Yes." His eyes closed briefly. There it was. The answer. Grace folded the towel and placed it beside the basin. "I didn't know you couldn't." "Would have been useful information." Walter nodded once. "No defense, no one makes it anymore." Grace looked toward the hallway. "Someone used to." Walter removed his gloves slowly. "Sarah." Grace waited. He crossed to the coffee pot, poured a cup, and stood with it in both hands without drinking. "My wife," I guessed. She and Nellie baked apple cake every Sunday. His thumb moved once over the rim of the mug. "Even when we didn't have much sugar," Sarah said, "Sunday ought to smell different from the rest of the week." Grace leaned against the work table. Walter kept his eyes on the coffee. She'd put Nellie on a chair by the counter. Let her stir. Half the flour ended up on the floor. A faint breath left him, almost a laugh. It didn't last. Grace said nothing. Walter stared toward the stove. The day before the accident was Sunday. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods with a dry whisper. Grace's hands became still. Walter took his cup to the table. He sat in Nellie's chair first, seemed to notice, then shifted to the larger one beside it. Grace poured herself coffee. She sat across from him. "You don't have to tell me." "I know." He was quiet a long time. Then he began anyway. They had been coming back from Pine Ridge late in January. Sarah had wanted to stay overnight at her sister's place because freezing rain had started before supper. Walter had looked at the sky, looked at the road, made the choice. "I'd driven that mountain grade in worse." His voice stayed even. That made it harder to hear. "I told her we'd be home before the real cold settled." He looked down at his hands. The road was ice by the time we reached Miller's Bend. Grace knew the road. Everyone who traveled between Pine Ridge and the foothills did. A narrow piece of track with rock on one side and a long slope on the other. Walter continued. One wheel slid. He stopped there. Grace did not need more. After a while, he said, "The wagon went over. The stove gave a quiet pop. Nellie survived because Sarah had wrapped her in 2 quilts. Walter swallowed. Sarah didn't. Grace held the mug but did not drink. "I was driving." 3 words. He said them differently from everything else. Not information. Sentence. "She died before we got her back to town." Grace's eyes stayed on him. "Nellie spoke that night?" Walter nodded. "Cried for her mother until she fell asleep." "And afterward?" "Next morning, nothing." He looked toward the ceiling, as if someone had shut a door. Grace thought of the child standing beside the apple pan. The white face. The quick breath. Walter rubbed one palm across his beard. The doctor in Pine Ridge examined her. Said there was nothing wrong with her throat. Another doctor came through that summer and said the same thing. His mouth tightened. A preacher told me she needed discipline. Grace's expression must have changed. Walter noticed. I didn't let him near her again. Good. He said grief couldn't make a child mute forever. Preachers aren't doctors. He wasn't much of a preacher either. Grace almost smiled. Walter finally drank the coffee. It had probably gone cold. "Do you think she remembers the accident?" Grace asked. "Yes." "How much?" "I don't know. Have you asked?" His eyes lifted. Grace saw the answer, no. Walter's hand tightened around the mug. "I don't ask her about that day." "Why?" "Because she doesn't need me making her live through it again." "Maybe." The word made him look at her. Grace set her mug down. "Or maybe you don't need to hear what she remembers." His expression hardened. Not anger exactly. A man bracing. Grace did not soften the thought. "You believe she stopped speaking because of you." Walter's eyes went to the table. "She lost her mother because I made the decision to drive. She lost her mother in an accident. I made the decision. You're determined to make those the same sentence." "They are." Grace studied him. For all his size, he looked suddenly trapped inside something much smaller than the kitchen. "You know what I think? No. You've already decided the trial, passed sentence, and spent nearly 2 years carrying it out." He looked at her. Grace leaned back. "And now you're asking a 6-year-old child to be the only person who can pardon you." His face went very still. "That isn't what I'm doing. Maybe not on purpose." He said nothing. Grace glanced toward the hallway. "You say Nellie might blame you. She has reason, she also might not. Walter's jaw moved. You didn't see her after? No. You didn't hear her calling for Sarah? No. You weren't there. Grace held his gaze. No, I wasn't. Silence. She let it settle before continuing. But Nellie was. His eyes changed. Grace lowered her voice. And she was 5 years old. Walter looked toward the kitchen doorway. Grace followed his gaze. No Nellie. Only the empty hall. A child should not have to carry the job of forgiving a grown man who's already decided he's guilty, Grace said. Walter's eyes dropped. She stood. That was enough. More would turn truth into pressure, and she had learned early that pressure could ruin bread and people in much the same way. She took both mugs. At the wash basin, Walter spoke. What should I do? Grace looked back. It was the first time he had asked her something that had nothing to do with food. Nothing tonight. His brow furrowed. You're very fond of doing nothing. Only when doing something would be about making ourselves feel better instead of helping her. He absorbed that. Grace dried the mugs. Tomorrow I'll make something without apples. Walter nodded. And I won't use cinnamon unless she's somewhere else. Another nod. Don't throw the jar away. Grace paused. He was staring at the table. Sarah liked it. Grace understood. I won't. That evening she found a small wooden box in the pantry. She put the cinnamon jar inside it and set it on the highest shelf. Not hidden, not displayed, simply kept. Later, as Grace crossed the dark passage toward her room, she saw light beneath the kitchen door. She opened it a few inches. Walter sat alone at the table. The fire had burned down to red coals. Sarah's old cinnamon jar stood in front of him. He had taken it from the shelf but had not opened it. His big hands rested on either side of the box. Grace almost stepped inside. She stopped herself. Walter did not need company merely because she had noticed his loneliness. She pulled the door closed without making a sound. Upstairs, Nellie's room remained quiet. Grace passed it slowly. The crooked bread horse still sat beside the bed. And down in the kitchen, Walter Mercer remained beside a dying fire, staring at a little jar of cinnamon and beginning, perhaps for the first time in nearly 2 years, to wonder whether grief had been telling him the truth. 3 mornings later, Grace discovered that grief was not the only thing Walter Mercer had been carrying alone. The discovery began with flour. She kept a running account of the kitchen in the back pages of her mother's recipe ledger. Flour, sugar, coffee, salt, dried beans, lamp oil, rendered fat. Every purchase had a date beside it, and when Walter remembered to bring one home, a receipt from Pine Ridge. Grace noticed the flour first. A 50-pound sack had cost nearly a third more than the one purchased 6 weeks earlier. Feed had climbed too, so had coal oil. She checked the figures twice. Then she went looking for the missing receipts. Walter's office sat at the front of the house beside the parlor. Grace had entered only once before, to leave supper when he was working late. She knocked. Come in. Walter sat behind a broad pine desk beneath a wall map of the ranch. His sleeves were rolled past his wrists, and 3 columns of figures covered the paper in front of him. Grace held up a flour receipt. Question. He set down his pencil. That sounds dangerous. You've learned quickly. He almost smiled. Grace put the receipt on his desk. Why did flour jump 31% since October? Walter glanced at it. Freight. Some of it. She put down another receipt. Not all. His eyes moved from the paper to her. Grace opened the ledger. Coffee's up. Feed's up more. Salt stayed about the same, which means this isn't simply every price in town rising together. Walter leaned back. You doing my accounts now? No, I'm doing mine. She tapped the page. And yours are interfering with them. That got a longer look. Grace waited. Walter gathered 2 papers and turned them face down. The ranch accounts are my concern. Fine. She picked up her receipt. Then you can explain to 25 men why they're getting thinner biscuits. His brow lowered. I'm not cutting their food. Then somebody pays for it. I will. With what? Silence. There it was. Grace did not press immediately. She had spent enough years around men who carried bad news in their shoulders to recognize when the answer was already in the room. Walter looked toward the window. Outside, 2 hands were driving cattle through the lower corral. Snow lay thin along the fence shadows. Last winter was bad, he said. Grace stayed where she was. We lost cattle in February. More than I expected. How many? 73. That was not a small number. Grace looked at the papers he had turned over. And this year? Feed costs are worse. Buyers? His jaw tightened. 2 still owe me from the autumn shipments. How much? Walter gave her the figure. Grace stopped moving. That much? Yes. And you're still carrying payroll? Yes. And buying winter feed? Yes. And you plan to tell nobody? It's my ranch. Grace closed the ledger. And these are your men. Your daughter. Your kitchen. Your winter. He looked at her sharply. She held his gaze. Walter finally exhaled and turned the papers back over. Sit down. Grace did. He pushed one sheet across the desk. It was a list of outstanding payments, written neatly in his blocky hand. 2 cattle buyers in Cheyenne. 1 freight company disputing a delivery. A feed merchant requiring cash after New Year's. Grace read it once. Then again. You're not ruined. Walter's mouth twitched without humor. Comforting. You aren't. No. But you're tight. Yes. How tight? If the buyers pay before January, manageable. And if they don't? Walter looked at the map rather than her. I sell stock earlier than I want, into winter prices. Yes, which means less. Yes. Grace leaned back. For a moment, the only sound was the ticking clock on the shelves. Then she said, Show me the kitchen purchases for the last 3 months. Walter looked at her. Why? Because that's the part I can change. He hesitated, then opened the bottom desk drawer and removed a tied bundle of receipts. Grace spent the next hour at his desk. Walter returned to his own figures at first, then stopped pretending not to watch her. Grace sorted receipts into stacks. Meat, dry goods, flour, coffee, produce. She made notes in the margin of a blank sheet. Finally, she said, You're throwing money away. Walter's eyebrows rose. I am? Your old cook was. She held up a butcher receipt. He ordered trimmed cuts for stew. Walter stared at her. What's wrong with that? Nothing, if you're feeding bankers. She placed it down. You have cattle. Use the cheaper cuts. Slow cooking makes them tender. Save the bones for stock. Render the fat. Stop buying lard in town. Another receipt. You've been buying dried biscuits for the North Riders. They keep. So do mine. You make trail biscuits? I fed railroad crews. Grace looked at him over the page. I know how to make food survive men who forget it's in a saddlebag. That almost smile appeared. She ignored it. Stale bread becomes pudding at breakfast. Beef scraps go into hand pies. Apple peel goes into vinegar if we have enough. We can stretch beans with barley instead of buying more meat for every stew. Walter leaned forward. How much? What? How much can you cut? Grace looked back over the figures. Kitchen expenses? 15% without anybody noticing. His expression changed. Maybe 20 if your men stop treating coffee like creek water. They won't. Then 15. Walter stood and crossed to the window. Grace gathered the receipts. You asked what I could change. I didn't. You were going to. He looked back. She saw it then. Not offense, calculation. Hope, perhaps, though Walter wore hope cautiously. He returned to the desk. Instead of taking the receipts from her, he pushed the ranch ledger across the table. The heavy book stopped beneath Grace's hand. What else do you see? She looked at him. The question was simple. The gesture was not. This was his desk, his accounts, his ranch. Until that moment, Grace had been an employee who happened to notice things. Now he had moved the ledger into the space between them. Grace opened it. She read slowly. Feed purchases, veterinary expenses, fencing, freight, winter wages. Her finger stopped. This number. Walter leaned closer. Which? She pointed. You're hauling feed from Pine Ridge twice a month. Yes. Why not once? Storage. Where? South shed. Roof leaks. Yes. So repair the roof. It needs new boards. Grace turned the page. You purchased boards in September. For the calving pens. According to this, you bought 20 more than the foreman requested. Walter looked at the line, then at her. Those are still stacked behind the barn. You know that? I walk past them every morning. His gaze stayed on her. Grace became aware that they were sitting much closer than when they started. His shoulder nearly touched hers. She turned another page. Use 6 on the shed roof. Consolidate the feed trips. You'll save freight. Walter bent over the entry. Grace reached for the pencil at the same moment he did. Their hands met. Neither moved. His fingers rested partly over hers. Warm. Rough. Grace looked down, then up. Walter was already looking at her. The office seemed suddenly smaller. She could hear the clock. 1 tick. 2. His hand loosened, but did not leave. Grace's breath caught in an irritatingly noticeable way. Then something struck the floor in the hallway. Clack! They separated at once. Walter stood so quickly, his chair scraped backward. Grace closed the ledger. Nellie stood in the doorway. Her wooden spoon lay at her feet. She looked first at Grace, then Walter, then at their hands, now very carefully, nowhere near each other. Grace cleared her throat. You dropped something. Nellie looked down as if surprised to find the spoon there. Walter picked it up and handed it to her. Nellie took it. Her eyes moved between them once more. Then she walked away. Grace stared after her. Walter rubbed the back of his neck. She notices too much. Wonder where she gets that. He looked at Grace. This time the smile came properly. Not large, not easy, but real. Grace found herself smiling back before she could stop it. Walter glanced toward the ledger. 15%? At least. And the feed trips? Repair the shed first. He nodded. Anything else? Grace tapped the book. Oh, plenty. His smile faded into something quieter. Then keep looking. Grace lowered her eyes to the figures again. But neither of them leaned quite as close this time. Not because they wanted more distance, because now they knew exactly how little distance there had been. The next week passed under a hard blue sky. Cold mornings, bright afternoons, long shadows stretching from the barns before 4 o'clock. Grace changed the kitchen accounts exactly as she had promised. The butcher orders shrank. The stockpot never seemed to leave the stove. Bread heels became pudding with raisins on Sundays. Beef scraps disappeared into hand pies the riders could carry in coat pockets without making a mess of themselves. Nobody complained. Walter noticed. He always noticed. One evening he came into the kitchen with 3 receipts folded inside his coat. He placed them beside Grace's cutting board. "You were right." Grace kept chopping carrots. "I usually am." The freight expense dropped. That happens when you stop paying a wagon to haul air. He leaned one hip against the table. "You enjoy this?" "What?" "Being right." Grace looked up. "Very much." Walter shook his head. The smile came and went. Nellie sat at the far end of the table, making rows of dried beans with her wooden spoon. For a little while, the kitchen felt almost easy. That was when Harvey Sloane chose to step into it. Grace first saw him in Pine Ridge on a Friday afternoon. She had gone in with Ben Foster for flour, lamp oil, yeast, and a new coffee grinder because the old one had finally surrendered with a noise like a pistol shot. The wind had pushed a thin crust of snow across Main Street. Grace came out of the general store carrying a paper-wrapped parcel beneath one arm when a man in a dark green coat stepped away from the hitching rail. He was perhaps 50, clean-shaven, silver beginning at his temples. His boots were polished despite the road. "Mrs. Holloway?" Grace stopped. "Yes?" "Harvey Sloane." She knew the name. Everyone at Red Willow did. His cattle grazed east of Mercer's Line. His ranch house had glass windows imported from Omaha. His riders wore matching saddle blankets because, according to Ben, Sloane liked everything he owned to look owned. Grace shifted the parcel beneath her arm. "What can I do for you, Mr. Sloane?" "Maybe the question is what I can do for you." Grace disliked the sentence immediately. Sloane smiled. "Walk with me." "No." His smile held. Direct woman. Cold day. He glanced toward the general store window. "Mercer paying you $15 a month?" Grace said nothing. "That means yes. Means it's none of your concern." "I'll pay 30. Grace looked at him. "For what?" "My kitchen. I already have one. A better one." "Does your stove cook twice as fast?" His eyes narrowed slightly. Then he laughed. "Walter's fortunate." Grace began walking toward the livery. Sloane fell into step beside her. "He won't be fortunate long." Grace kept moving. "Feed debt. Thin cash reserves. Buyers late on payment." She stopped. Sloane stopped too. The wind tugged at the hem of her coat. Grace looked at him. "You seem very interested in another man's bookkeeping. I am interested in the north pasture." There it was. Simple now. He nodded toward the white hills beyond town. Sheltered grass. Year-round creek. Mercer has more land than he can carry. And you want some. I want what makes sense. Grace started walking again. Sloane's voice followed. "You think you'll save him by cutting kitchen costs?" She turned. He stood with his gloves behind his back. "That ranch was in trouble before you arrived." Grace's fingers tightened around the parcel. "What exactly do you want from me?" "Leave." The word came pleasantly. "Take my offer. 30 a month. Private room. Better equipment." No need to manage 25 half-trained cowhands. Grace stared at him. You think if I leave, Red Willow fails? I think Mercer loses another support. Grace almost laughed. You've mistaken me for a beam. Sloane's expression barely changed. No. I know exactly what you are. The way he said it made something old and familiar tighten inside her. He looked at her coat, her shoulders, her figure, not crudely, almost worse, evaluating. Walter Mercer has been lonely a long time, he said. Grace went still. Sloane continued. A capable woman comes into a cold house, cooks well, handles numbers, gets along with the child. Grace's face gave him nothing. He stepped closer, though not enough to be improper. Men are grateful during hard winters, Mrs. Holloway. His voice lowered. Spring comes. Gratitude changes. She held his gaze. And what exactly is that supposed to mean? That men like Walter Mercer know the difference between what helps them survive and what they choose when survival isn't the question anymore. Grace heard every word. The road behind Sloane seemed suddenly very quiet. She had heard versions of it before. Different towns, different men, different wording. Useful, dependable, strong, never chosen. Grace shifted the parcel into both hands. Are you finished? Sloane's eyes searched her face. I don't mean offense. That usually means you've already given it. I am offering you security. No. You're offering me money to help hurt a man who trusted me. His mouth tightened. Grace stepped around him. Keep your $30. She walked away. Sloane called after her. Think on it. Grace did not turn. I already did. The ride back to Red Willow took nearly an hour. Ben talked twice. Grace answered both times. She could not remember afterward what he had said. That evening, she served supper, cleaned the kitchen, checked the flower order, and went to her room before Walter came down for coffee. The next night, she did the same. On the third, Walter found her in the pantry, measuring dried beans into a crock. You stopped eating with us. Grace kept measuring. I eat later. Why, work? You always have work. She set the scoop down. Anything else, Mr. Mercer? His eyes changed at the formality. You're calling me Mr. Mercer again. I believe that's your name. He leaned against the pantry frame. Did something happen in town? Grace reached for the crock lid. No. Walter did not move. She looked at him. Are you going to block the doorway all night? If needed. You're too large for that, to be fair. I know. Despite herself, her mouth almost softened. Almost. Walter saw it. Then it disappeared. Grace. The sound of her first name made her hand stop. He rarely used it. Not carelessly. What happened? She looked at the shelf. Harvey Sloane offered me a job. Walter's face hardened. How much? Twice what you pay. And? I said no. His shoulders eased, but only slightly. What else? Grace stared at him. He waited. That man doesn't make a trip into town just to hire a baker. No. He wants the north pasture. Yes. He thinks if he removes enough pieces, you'll sell. Walter said nothing. Grace looked down at her hands. He also had an opinion about why you've kept me here. That changed him. What did he say? It doesn't matter. It mattered enough to keep you out of the dining room for 3 nights. Grace put both palms flat against the work table. For several seconds, she could hear only the faint clink of pans from the kitchen beyond. Then she said, He said men are grateful in winter. Walter's jaw tightened. And? That spring comes. Silence. Grace finally looked at him. He said, a man like you knows the difference between a woman who is useful and a woman he would choose. Walter's eyes did not move from hers. Grace hated that her throat had tightened. She hated more that she cared about his answer. He wanted to make me doubt you, she said. I know that. Walter took one step into the pantry. Grace stayed where she was, but he didn't invent the question. Walter's breathing changed. Barely. Grace met his eyes. What exactly do you see when you look at me there? No protection left around it. No flower accounts. No jokes. No easy retreat. Walter stared at her. His mouth opened. Closed. Grace watched the answer fail to come. Not because there was none. That was almost worse. She saw his eyes flicker toward the hallway, toward the stairs, toward somewhere past her and far behind them both. Sarah. Grace understood it immediately. Desire could live beside grief. But Walter had not yet learned how to let both breathe in the same room. His silence stretched. Grace nodded once. That's what I thought. No. The word came quickly. She looked at him. Walter stepped forward, then stopped himself. His hands were open at his sides. That's not what you thought. Then tell me. He tried. She saw him try. His jaw tightened. His eyes held hers with an almost painful steadiness. But the words would not come. Grace picked up the bean crock. Good night, Walter. He moved aside. She passed him. At the doorway he said, Grace. She stopped, but did not turn. I don't see you the way Sloane does. Her fingers tightened around the crock. That isn't the same as telling me how you do. No answer. Grace walked into the kitchen. Nellie was standing by the table. She had heard enough to know something was wrong, though perhaps not enough to know what. Grace set the crock down. Nellie looked toward the pantry, then back at Grace. Her small hand reached for Grace's sleeve. Grace covered it gently with her own. It's all right. Nellie stared up at her. Grace smiled for the child. A small one. Good enough to hold. Behind them, Walter remained in the pantry doorway, silent and enormous, and for the first time since Grace had met him, looking like a man who understood that silence could wound even when it was never meant as cruelty. The next morning, the weather changed. Grace noticed it before sunrise. The kitchen windows had gone white at the corners, and when she opened the back door to throw out wash water, the air had that dead, waiting stillness that came before serious snow. No birds, no loose chain knocking at the gate. Even the cattle seemed quieter. Walter came in before breakfast carrying a length of frozen rope over one shoulder. Grace glanced at him. Storm. He nodded. By noon. Bad. He looked toward the dark window. Could be. That was all he said. By 9, the sky had dropped low enough to seem caught on the tops of the pines. The men moved faster around the ranch. Hay was dragged beneath cover. Water troughs were broken free of ice. Extra wood came in from the shed and was stacked beside the kitchen wall. Grace packed biscuits, dried beef, hard cheese, and coffee into canvas sacks for the riders, who still had work beyond the main corrals. Walter passed through the kitchen twice without lingering. The second time, Nellie was at the table pressing flour flat beneath her wooden spoon. Walter crouched beside her. You stay close to Mrs. Holloway today. Nellie looked at him. He brushed one loose strand of hair from her face, only because she leaned into his hand first. Grace saw it. Walter stood. There are 4 men at the North Line shack. Grace stopped wrapping bread. You left men out there? They were repairing fence yesterday. Snow came early. How far? 7 miles. Grace looked toward the window again. The first flakes had started. Small, dry, fast. They can wait it out. Walter shook his head. Roof leaks. Chimneys cracked. They've got food for one night. Then send someone after them now. I am. Grace looked at him. There was something in his tone she did not like. Who? Walter reached for the supply sack. Me. Ben. 2 others. No. He looked at her. Grace rarely told him no. Maybe that was why the word stopped him. The wind's already turning. I know. You just said the shack is 7 miles out. Yes. And you know this country better than anybody here, which means you know exactly how fast 7 miles becomes 50 in a whiteout. His jaw tightened. They're my men, and Nellie is your daughter. The words landed hard. Grace regretted the sharpness of them immediately. Walter's face changed. Not anger. Pain. Grace softened her voice. Send the extra hands. Stay here. I won't send them somewhere I won't go myself. That sounds noble until it leaves a 6-year-old without a father. Silence. Nellie had stopped moving the spoon. Walter glanced at her. Grace saw the hesitation. For 1 second she thought she had reached him. Then he picked up the sack. I'll be back before dark. Grace stared at him. Outside, the wind found the house. The windows rattled. When? Before dark. That isn't an answer. He pulled on his gloves. It is the one I have. Grace followed him into the hall. Walter put on his coat. Nellie appeared in the kitchen doorway behind them. He saw her. His whole face altered. He knelt. The giant cowboy and the silent little girl looked at each other in the dim hallway, while snow began tapping against the glass. Walter held out his hand. Nellie came to him. He wrapped one arm around her and closed his eyes. Grace looked away. When he stood, he told Nellie, if the wind gets worse, you go with Grace to the root cellar. Understand? Nellie nodded. Walter looked at Grace. The cellar door sticks. Pull up, then toward you. I know how doors work. Grace. She stopped. His eyes held hers. Something from the night before still stood between them, unanswered. Now there was no room for it. Grace folded her arms. You coming back? Walter looked toward the front door, then back at her. I intend to. Her throat tightened. That isn't the same thing. No. At least he did not lie. He opened the door. Cold air rushed through the hall. Walter stepped outside. The snow swallowed him quickly. By noon, Red Willow had disappeared beyond its own fences. The world ended at the kitchen windows. Grace kept the stove hot and the lamps trimmed. Men came in and out with scarves crusted white around their faces. Every time the back door opened, she looked. Every time it was someone else. Nellie stayed close, not clinging, watching. At 2, Grace checked the clock. At 3, she checked again. At 4, the room had gone dark enough for full lamplight. No Walter. Ben had gone with him. No Ben either. Grace kneaded bread she did not need to knead because her hands required work. Push, fold, turn, push, fold, turn. Nellie sat across the table, watching. At 4:30, a horse screamed outside. Grace's hands stopped. The back door burst open. One of the ranch hands came in, breathing hard. Horse came back. Grace wiped her hands on her apron. Whose? The man did not answer quickly enough. she already knew. Walter's bay stood near the barn, sides heaving, reins dragging through the snow. No rider. One stirrup leather hung twisted. Grace stopped 3 feet from the horse. The animal's coat was white with ice. Her chest went cold in a way the weather had nothing to do with. Where are the others? Don't know. Ben? No sign yet. Tracks? Already filling. The foreman, Thomas Hale, came running from the barn. We're putting a search party together. Grace turned toward him. Take lanterns, rope, blankets, coffee. Hale nodded. North Trail first. No. He looked at her. Grace forced herself to think. Not feel, think. Walter had spoken about winter routes before. Not to her directly. During kitchen supper. Once while looking over feed schedules. Something. The ridge. He had said something about the ridge. She closed her eyes. Then remembered. If Miller's Ridge freezes, don't cross the top. Take the lower ravine. Wind stacks snow against the western face. Grace opened her eyes. He wouldn't use the ridge. Hale frowned. What? Walter said when the top freezes, the wind stacks snow against it. He'd take the lower ravine toward Black Pine Creek. That adds a mile. He'd take it anyway if he had men with him. Hale looked toward the storm, then back at her. Could be. Start there. He gave one sharp nod. The men moved. Nellie stood in the kitchen doorway. Grace had forgotten she was there. The child was trembling, not from cold. Her hands were clutched against her chest. Grace went to her. Slowly. She did not touch her. Nellie. The girl's eyes were wide. Grace lowered herself to the floor. The house groaned around them. Your papa knows this country. Nellie's breath hitched. He knows snow. He knows horses. And there are men looking for him. The child shook her head violently. Grace held out both hands. Open. Empty. Nellie stared at them. Then at Grace. Her lips moved. No sound. Grace waited. Nellie's breathing came faster. Her mouth opened again. Grace saw the effort in her face. Not practice now. Need. Pure need. Pete! Grace went still. Nellie tried again. Pa! The word broke. The child's eyes filled. Then suddenly it came out. Papa. Grace's heart stopped. The men at the door froze. No one moved. Nellie drew one sharp breath, then louder. Papa! Grace's eyes burned. She reached forward only when Nellie lunged into her. Grace wrapped both arms around the child. Nellie's whole body shook against her. Behind them, Thomas Hale removed his hat. No one said a word. Outside, the storm howled across Red Willow Ranch. Walter Mercer was somewhere inside that white darkness. Missing. Injured. Maybe worse. And the daughter who had not spoken for nearly 2 years had finally found her voice because she was terrified she had lost him too. Grace held Nellie until the child's shaking eased. Outside, lantern light moved through the storm. Men shouted over the wind as horses were saddled and ropes tied behind the cantles. Thomas Hale stepped back into the kitchen long enough to pull on a second pair of gloves. We're leaving now, Grace stood. Lower ravine. Hale nodded. Black Pine Creek first. Grace looked toward the window. Snow pressed against the glass in thick white sheets. You'll lose the trail past the cottonwoods. We know. Walter said there's an old split pine near the ravine entrance. The trail bends south just beyond it. Hale studied her. You sure? No. It was the truth. But I'm more sure of that than the ridge. Hale nodded once. Then he was gone. Nellie stood beside Grace, gripping her apron again. She had not spoken another word. Grace did not ask her to. The first one had already cost the child enough. They waited. That was the hardest part. Grace could make bread while she waited. She could heat coffee. She could fill blankets with stove-warmed stones and stack them near the door. She could put a pot of broth over the fire in case men came back half-frozen. But she could not go into the storm herself. Not with Nellie. Not when the ranch needed someone keeping the house ready. So she worked and listened. Every gust sounded like hoofbeats. Every strike of a branch against the roof made Nellie look up. At 7 o'clock, Grace checked the clock and wished she had not. At 8, the storm eased enough that the barn roof appeared beyond the kitchen window. At 8:10, a lantern moved near the far gate. Grace froze. Another lantern followed. Then another. "Stay here," she told Nellie. The child ignored her. They reached the porch together. The first horse came through the blowing snow, carrying Ben Foster. His face was gray with cold, but he was upright. The second rider led a horse with a man slumped low over the saddle. Grace's hand found the porch post. Walter, even bent forward, she knew the size of him. Hale shouted for help. The ranch hands moved fast. Grace pulled Nellie against her side before the child could run into the horses. "Papa!" The word came again. Walter did not lift his head. Grace's stomach turned. Inside, Hale said, "Now." They carried Walter through the front door on a canvas ground sheet. His coat had been cut away at one side. Snow had frozen into his beard. His face looked wrong without its usual color. Grace followed them into the parlor. "What happened?" "Horse went down in the ravine," Hale said. "Pinned his leg. We found him under a drift. Was he awake?" "On and off." "Doctor?" "No getting to Pine Ridge tonight." Ben pulled off his hat. Doc Barnes taught Hale how to set a simple brake last spring. Grace looked at Hale. The foreman gave a grim nod. "We can keep him warm until the road opens." Grace did what she could. Dry blankets, hot broth, warm bricks wrapped in cloth. Nothing dramatic, just small things placed where they were needed. Walter woke sometime after midnight. His eyes opened slowly. Grace was sitting near the hearth. She stood. "Don't move." His brow tightened. "Grace?" "Yes." He tried to sit. Pain stopped him. "What happened?" "Your horse slipped. Hale found you in the lower ravine." His eyes closed. "The men?" "All 4 from the line shack are back." His face eased. Then his eyes opened again. "Nellie." Grace looked toward the doorway. The child stood there in her nightdress. She had refused to sleep. Walter saw her. "Nell." Nellie crossed the room. Walter held out one hand. She took one enormous finger between both of hers. Then she said it. "Papa." Walter went completely still. Grace watched his face. He looked at Nellie as if the child had become something impossible before him. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Nellie squeezed his finger. "Papa." Walter turned his head toward the wall. His shoulders moved once, then again. Grace looked down. She had never seen a man that large seem so defenseless. Nellie climbed carefully onto the edge of the bed. Walter drew her close with one arm. His face disappeared into her hair. Grace left the room. She closed the door behind her. No one needed to witness that. By morning, the snow had stopped. The road to Pine Ridge remained buried, but the sky had cleared hard and pale above the mountains. Walter's leg was splinted. His ribs were bruised badly enough that every breath made him wince, but he was awake and taking broth. Nellie had said Papa 4 more times. Each one seemed to undo him in a different place. Late that afternoon, Grace carried a cup of coffee into his room. Nellie was asleep in a chair beside the bed. Walter watched Grace set the cup down. "How long?" Grace knew immediately what he meant. She hesitated. His eyes sharpened. "How long has she been trying?" Grace looked at Nellie. "A few days." Walter's face changed. "You knew, I noticed. And you didn't tell me." "No." The word sat between them. Walter pushed himself higher against the pillows. "You knew my daughter was trying to speak. I suspected. You should have told me." Grace kept her voice level. "No." His jaw tightened. "Grace, if I'd told you, you'd have watched her every minute. I had a right to know. You would have asked whether she was trying again. You would have waited for it at breakfast, at supper. Every time she opened her mouth, you would have stopped breathing." His expression hardened. "You don't know that." Grace looked at him. "Yes, I do." Walter's hand tightened around the blanket. "She is my daughter." The sentence came fast. Too fast. As soon as he said it, the room changed. Grace did not move. Walter's face changed with it. He heard himself. Grace looked at Nellie sleeping beside him, then back at Walter. "Yes," she said quietly. "She is." "Grace, I didn't mean—" "You did." "No." "You were frightened." She picked up the empty broth bowl. "That doesn't make the words disappear." Walter tried to shift toward her and winced. Grace stopped instinctively. For half a second, concern pulled her forward. Then she caught herself. Walter saw that too. His voice lowered. "I was wrong." Grace nodded. "Yes." No argument. No rescue for him. She moved toward the door. "Grace." She stopped. He looked smaller against the pillows than she had ever seen him. "I shouldn't have said it." "No." She waited. He seemed to search for something else. Nothing came. Grace opened the door. Behind her, Nellie stirred. Walter looked from his daughter to Grace. Grace stepped into the hallway. Only when the door closed did she let her shoulders drop. She stood there for a moment holding the bowl in both hands. For weeks she had cooked in his kitchen, studied his ledgers, learned the sounds of his daughter moving through the house, and begun to believe that perhaps usefulness had grown into something else. One frightened sentence had reminded her how easily a place beside someone could become a place outside them. Inside the room, Walter stared at the closed door. Nellie woke and looked toward it, then at him. Walter lowered his eyes. For the first time since his rescue, hearing his daughter's voice did not feel only like a miracle. It also showed him exactly how much Grace Holloway had given his house, and how quickly one careless sentence might have driven her out of it. For the next 4 days, Red Willow Ranch grew quieter in ways that had nothing to do with snow. Grace still rose before dawn. She still lit the kitchen stove, checked the bread sponge, ground coffee, and sent the men out with hot food before first light. She still brought Walter broth at noon and coffee in the afternoon while his leg remained bound in splints. But she stopped lingering, stopped sitting at the edge of the desk while he went through receipts, stopped asking whether the North Pasture crews needed extra trail food, stopped looking at him long enough for silence to become anything more than silence. Walter noticed every bit of it. He tried twice to speak. The first time, Grace was carrying clean linens upstairs. Grace. She stopped. Walter stood in the parlor doorway on crutches, one shoulder braced against the frame. I meant what I said yesterday. So did I. He tightened his grip on the crutch. I was frightened. I know. I was wrong. I know that too. Then she continued upstairs. The second time, he came to the kitchen after supper. Grace was shaping loaves. Nellie sat beside her, pressing small circles into a scrap of dough. Walter stopped near the table. Can we talk? Grace did not look up. About what? He opened his mouth. Nellie watched him. Walter looked at his daughter and then at Grace. Later. Grace nodded, but later never came. 2 mornings after that, a letter arrived from Pine Ridge. It was addressed to Grace. She recognized the handwriting. Mrs. Ada Bell, who had worked with her years earlier in Council Bluffs. Grace opened it beside the pantry window. Ada's note was brief. The Union Hotel in Laramie needed someone to run its bakery. Steady wages, a private room, full control over bread and pastry orders. The owner had tasted Grace's rolls years ago and remembered them. The position would open after Christmas. Grace read the letter twice, then folded it carefully. She did not feel relieved. That bothered her. A month earlier, a stable position would have felt like salvation. Now the paper in her hand felt heavier than it should. She slipped it into her apron pocket. That afternoon, she wrote her answer. Yes. She would come. She sanded the ink, folded the page, and sealed it. Walter saw the envelope on the kitchen table. He did not ask. Grace almost wished he would. He did not. 3 days later, he learned anyway. Mrs. Pritchard sent a boy from town with a message asking when Grace planned to leave so the eastbound stage could be held a place. Walter was in the hall when the boy delivered it. Grace came from the pantry and stopped. The boy looked between them. Ma'am? Grace took the note. Thank you. The boy left. Walter remained where he was. You're leaving. It was not a question. Grace folded the paper. Yes. When? Next Monday. His face gave nothing away at first. Then his hand shifted on the crutch. Laramie? Yes. What kind of work? Hotel bakery. Better pay? A little. Better kitchen? I haven't seen it yet. Walter looked down the hall toward the stove. Then why go? Grace held the note between both hands, because asking that question meant he still did not understand. Because I came here to work. You are working, and somewhere along the way I forgot that was all I was promised. His eyes sharpened. That isn't all. Grace looked at him. Walter's mouth opened. Again, the words stalled. She gave him time. Enough time. He could not say them. Grace nodded once. That is exactly the problem. She stepped around him. Walter turned with difficulty. Grace. She stopped. His voice was lower now. You matter here. To the kitchen? No. To Nellie? His jaw tightened. No. To the ranch? No. Grace looked at him. Then say what you mean. Silence. His face tightened with frustration. At himself. Not her. But silence was silence. Grace looked away. I can't keep building a home out of things you almost say. She went upstairs. That evening, she packed. Not much. 2 dresses. Her mother's ledger. A good apron. The rolling pin she had brought from Nebraska. 3 letters, 1 pair of gloves. Her carpet bag looked almost exactly as it had when she arrived. That hurt more than she expected. Nellie saw it before Walter did. The child appeared in Grace's doorway after supper. She stared at the open carpet bag on the bed, then at Grace. Grace folded the blue dress. Nellie walked toward the bag and touched the leather handle. Grace sat beside her. "I'm going to another town." Nellie looked at her. Grace did not say forever, did not say maybe. Children deserved clear things. "I leave Monday." Nellie's hand stayed on the bag. Grace covered it gently. "You didn't do anything wrong." Nellie stared at her. Her lips moved. No sound came. Grace felt something twist beneath her ribs. She smiled anyway. "It's all right." Nellie pulled her hand free and left the room. Grace sat there for a long time. On Sunday evening, she made biscuits one last time. Not because the ranch needed them, because Nellie liked to split them and put too much jam in the middle. The kitchen was warm. Snowmelt ticked from Walter's boots near the door. His leg was healing enough that he could stand without both crutches now, though not without pain. Grace removed the tray from the oven. Behind her, she heard the quick sound of bare feet. She turned. Nellie stood beside the table in her nightdress, just as she had in the kitchen 5 weeks later in Grace's memory. Except this was the night that led there. The carpet bag sat near the back door, packed, ready. Nellie saw it. Her face changed. She crossed the room and caught Grace's skirt. "Grace." The word stopped every sound in the kitchen. Grace froze. Walter stood in the doorway. One hand gripped the frame. Nellie's fingers tightened in Grace's skirt. Then she said it again. "Grace, stay." The tray struck the edge of the stove with a hard clang. One biscuit rolled to the floor. Grace did not look at Walter. She dropped to her knees. Nellie's eyes were wet. Grace cupped the child's face gently. "Listen to me." Nellie swallowed. "You speaking does not mean you have to keep me here." The child's lip trembled. "You don't owe me that." Grace brushed one thumb beneath her eye. "I love hearing your voice." Nellie stared at her. "But your voice belongs to you." Grace swallowed. "And where I go has to belong to me." Behind them, Walter made no sound. Grace looked at Nellie for a long moment, then pulled her into her arms. The child held tight. Grace closed her eyes. She had thought leaving would become simpler once the choice was made. It had not. Across the room, Walter watched them. And for the first time, he understood that asking Grace to stay because Nellie needed her would be another form of cowardice. If he wanted her to remain at Red Willow, he would have to say what he had failed to say before. Not what the ranch needed, not what his daughter needed, what he needed. And whether he could find those words before Monday morning was now the only question that mattered. Monday never got the chance to arrive quietly. By sunrise on Sunday, a rider from Pine Ridge was pounding at the Red Willow gate. Grace heard the horse before she saw it. She was in the kitchen, sealing jars of rendered beef fat, when Ben Foster opened the back door and called for Walter. The rider brought a letter from the First Territorial Bank. Walter read it standing in the hall. Grace watched his face. He did not curse. That worried her more. "What is it?" Walter folded the paper once. "Short-term note. Called in?" "Yes." "How long?" 10 days. Grace stared at him. "That isn't enough time for spring cattle." "No." "Who pushed it?" He looked toward the window. Sloan. She did not ask how he knew. She already did. By noon, the whole ranch felt different. Men spoke lower. Walter spent an hour with his foreman over the accounts. Grace kept working, but her packed carpetbag stayed beside the back door. She had meant to leave in the morning. Instead, she found herself calculating. Flour, salt, dried apples, beef, cured meat. How much could move? How quickly? What could be sold before cattle could? At 3, she pulled her mother's ledger from the shelf and went to Walter's office. He was seated behind the desk, one crutch against the wall. She put the ledger down. "I have an idea." Walter looked tired. "Tell me." No dismissal. No warning. Just that. Grace opened to a page of figures. Mining camps. He frowned. What about them? Half the roads north are bad. Supply wagons are delayed. Yes. Which means camps are paying more for food that travels. Walter leaned forward. Grace continued. We have beef, flour, dried fruit, salt. Enough hands to work around the clock for a few days if they agree. You want to sell meals? Provisions. She tapped the page. Preserved meat. Bread. Hard biscuits. Dried apple turnovers. Hand pies that keep longer than fresh bread. Enough for men who don't have time to cook. Walter looked at the numbers. Can we make enough? Grace met his eyes. Yes. How much? Enough to cover the note if we get the order. His expression tightened. If? Yes. And if we fail? Grace closed the ledger. Then you lose the pasture anyway. Walter sat back. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he asked the question she had been waiting months to hear. What do you need? Grace looked at him. Not what can I do, not that's impossible. What do you need? She answered immediately. Every clean flour sack, the smokehouse inventory, Ben and 2 others on packing. Someone in Pine Ridge who can reach the mining supply agent before Sloan does. Walter nodded. Done. And I need authority over the kitchen until the order is filled. You have it. No one overrides portions. No one takes food without asking. Not even you. His mouth almost moved. Especially me? Especially you. Done. By evening, Red Willow had become a different kind of ranch. The bunkhouse men hauled crates. Grace worked at the long table until flour coated her sleeves to the elbow. Nellie sat on a stool beside her, pressing wax seals onto wrapped packets with both hands. Walter moved slowly on his healing leg, checking lists, arranging wagons, sending a rider to Pine Ridge. At midnight, Grace found him outside the kitchen door, trying to lift a heavy crate. She took one look at his leg. Put that down. I can carry it. That is exactly the kind of sentence that put you under a horse. Walter stared at her, then set the crate down. Grace pointed toward a stack of invoices. You can carry those. He obeyed. That almost made her smile. The next morning, Pine Ridge was crowded. Teamsters, ranchers, merchants, men waiting for news about the roads. Grace had come in with Walter to speak to the supply agent. They found Harvey Sloan already there. Of course he was. Sloan stood outside the freight office in a dark coat, talking with 2 merchants. He saw Grace first, then Walter. His mouth turned. Well, he said, Mercer's brought his cook to town. Walter stopped. Grace kept walking. Sloan's voice carried. Smart, maybe. Might as well show the creditors what they're financing. A few men looked away. Grace felt the old weight settle behind her ribs. Sloan smiled. Tell me, Mercer, is this how Red Willow survives now? Bread and charity? Walter went still. Grace saw it. That old stillness, the one that could become silence. Sloane looked at her. Or maybe I should say Mercer's fat cook has a business plan. The street seemed to pause. Grace looked at Walter. Not pleading, not asking. Just looking. Walter took one step forward. His face was calm. Sloane. Harvey smiled. Walter's voice carried clearly. Her name is Grace Holloway. The smile disappeared. Walter continued. She kept 25 men fed through the worst stretch of winter we've had in years. A few heads turned. She cut my food expenses when I was too stubborn to admit I needed help. Grace did not move. She found a way to make provisions out of what other people would have thrown away. Walter's hand tightened around the head of his cane. She helped save my ranch before any bank knew I was in trouble. Sloane opened his mouth. Walter did not let him speak, and she gave my daughter a place quiet enough to find her voice again. Now the whole street was listening. Grace's breath caught. Walter turned toward her, not toward Sloane, toward her. The worst mistake I've made since Grace came to Red Willow was letting anyone think she matters there only because of what she can do. Something in Grace's face gave way. Walter saw it. His voice dropped, but everyone could still hear. She matters because she is Grace. Silence. No grand gesture. No hand reached for hers. No claim made over her. Just the words. At last. Sloane gave a short laugh that nobody joined. This is touching. Walter turned back. No. It's expensive. A few men smiled. Walter nodded toward the freight office. Because while you've been talking, she's been building a contract. The mining supply agent stepped out behind them holding Grace's order sheet. He looked at Walter. Then Grace. I can take the first shipment tomorrow. Grace stared at him. How much? All of it, if the quality matches the samples. Her fingers tightened around the ledger. Walter looked at her. You heard him. Grace nodded once. The next 3 days became work without edges. Day bled into night. Bread cooled on every table. Beef simmered in iron pots. Dried apples were packed into paper and cloth. Men who had once treated the kitchen like a place food mysteriously appeared, now stood in line waiting for Grace's instructions. Walter did not interfere. Not once. When he had a question, he asked. When she answered, he listened. On the 4th morning, the first loaded wagon left Red Willow. Nellie stood beside Grace on the porch. Walter came out slowly. He watched the wagon disappear toward Pine Ridge, then looked at Grace. You postponed your stage. For the contract. I know. Grace met his eyes. Don't make more of it. I won't. He paused. Not yet. She looked at him. There was something different in his face now. Not fear gone, not grief gone. Just a man who had finally stopped using either one as an excuse to remain silent. Grace looked away first. There's another batch in the oven. Walter nodded. I'll stay out of your way. She turned toward the kitchen, then stopped. You don't have to stay out of it. Walter looked at her. Grace held his gaze for 1 second longer than necessary. Just don't stand in the doorway. His almost smile returned. This time she let herself smile back. Then she went inside to finish the work that might save Red Willow Ranch. And Walter followed, not ahead of her, not behind her, but beside her. The contract did not save them all at once. It came in wagons. 1 load of preserved beef, another of bread wrapped in cloth, crates of dried apples, sacks of hard biscuits stamped with Red Willow's mark in black ink. Each shipment left before sunrise, the wheels grinding over frozen ground while Grace stood on the porch with a ledger tucked beneath one arm and checked every crate against the receipt. Walter handled the bank. Grace handled everything that went into the wagons. Neither stepped on the other's work. That was new, and it worked. 6 days after the first shipment, Walter came into the kitchen carrying an envelope. Grace was standing at the table, scraping flour from the wood with the back of a knife. He set the envelope beside her hand. "What?" "Open it." She looked at him. "You're capable." "So are you, eh?" He waited. Grace wiped her fingers and broke the seal. Inside was a receipt from the bank, paid in full. She read it twice, then once more. Her shoulders lowered. Not dramatically, just enough for Walter to notice. "The north pasture?" she asked. "Still ours." Grace closed her eyes for one breath. When she opened them, Nellie was standing beside the stove with a piece of bread in her hand. Walter crouched, despite the stiffness still in his injured leg. "Come here." Nellie went to him. He held up the receipt. "You know what this is?" Nellie shook her head. "It means Mr. Sloan doesn't get our creek." Nellie considered that, then said carefully, "Good." Grace looked up. Walter looked at his daughter. The word was small, simple, but every word still stopped him for half a second. He smiled, a real smile now, not the almost smile Grace had spent weeks collecting in pieces. "Good," he agreed. The ranch breathed differently after that. Men laughed louder at supper. Ben Foster stopped counting how many biscuits he took. Thomas Hale repaired the loose hinge on the red gate without being told. The creditor's notices disappeared from Walter's desk. Harvey Sloan did not ride onto Red Willow Land again. Grace expected relief to make leaving easier. Instead, the opposite happened. The work was finished. The danger had passed. And now there was nothing left to hide behind. The stage to Laramie would leave Pine Ridge on Thursday morning. Grace packed Wednesday night. Again. The same carpet bag. The same dresses. The same recipe ledger. But this time there were more things that did not fit. A small wooden spoon Nellie had insisted she take. A linen cloth someone had embroidered with a crooked letter G.A. coffee mug Walter had repaired after the handle cracked. Grace stood over the bed looking at the bag, then removed the mug. Some things were too fragile for travel. She set it on the washstand. At dawn, Walter was not in the house. Grace noticed. She told herself she did not care. She carried the carpet bag downstairs. Nellie waited in the kitchen, fully dressed, coat buttoned wrong. Grace fixed the buttons. "You know I'll write?" Nellie nodded. "And if your papa answers my letters, I'll hear how you're doing." Nellie frowned. Grace smiled. "You can make him write." That earned the faintest little laugh. Then Nellie wrapped both arms around Grace's waist. Grace held her. Longer than she meant to. When she released her, Nellie whispered, "Stay." Grace's eyes closed. "We talked about this." "I know." That made it harder. The wagon waited outside. Ben had offered to drive her to Pine Ridge. Grace stepped onto the porch. The morning was clear and bitter. Hoarfrost silvered the corral rails. Smoke rose straight from the bunkhouse chimney. The bighorn foothills stood blue beneath a pale sky. Grace put one boot on the wagon step. "Grace." She stopped. Walter stood near the barn. He had no hat. Just his coat thrown over a work shirt. Hair windblown, breath smoking in the cold. He walked toward her with a slight hitch still left in his stride. Ben looked at Grace, then at Walter. "I'll check the harness." He disappeared around the wagon. Walter stopped 3 feet from her. Grace waited. He looked at the carpet bag. "You're still going?" "Yes. Even after everything. Especially after everything." His jaw tightened. Grace continued before he could misunderstand. "The ranch is safe. Nellie is speaking. The contract is done. So you don't need me." Grace almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. "This was never about whether I need you." Walter nodded slowly. "I know that now." She studied him. His hands hung at his sides. For a man who could lift a feed sack onto his shoulder like it weighed nothing, he looked strangely uncertain about what to do with them. Walter drew a breath. "I could ask you to stay because Nellie needs you." Grace said nothing. "I could ask because the ranch runs better with you here." Still nothing. "I could tell you half the men are going to mutiny when they taste whoever replaces you." That almost got her. Almost. Walter looked directly at her. But all of those would be the same mistake. Grace's fingers tightened around the carpetbag handle. "What mistake?" "Making your value about what you do for everybody else." The yard went quiet around them. Walter took one step closer. "I need to say this right." Grace's heart started beating harder. "Then take your time." He did. A horse shifted in the corral. Somewhere behind the barn, Ben made a great show of checking a harness buckle that did not need checking. Walter finally said, "When you came here, I thought I was hiring someone to feed my hands." Grace's mouth softened. "I noticed. I thought my life was already decided." Sarah was gone. Nellie was silent. Ranch needed work. That was enough. He looked toward the house. It wasn't. Grace waited. Walter's gaze returned to her. "I don't want you to stay because Nellie needs you." His voice lowered. "I don't want you to stay because Red Willow needs you." Grace barely breathed. "I want you to stay because I want a life that has you in it." There it was, no hiding place left. Grace looked down. The frost on the wagon wheel shone in the morning light. Walter continued. "I don't know what that life looks like yet." A pause. "I know I'm not asking you to marry me today." Grace looked up quickly. Walter almost smiled. "I've learned rushing things can make a mess." "That took you a while." "Yes." He accepted the blow. "I'd like to court you." Grace stared at him. "Properly." "Properly? I can ask permission before taking you to supper. You own the house where supper is served. I'll think of something." Her laugh escaped before she could stop it. Walter's face changed at the sound. Grace looked at him for a long moment. "What happens if I say yes?" "You stay because you choose to. And the kitchen, still yours to run. The bakery idea?" Walter nodded. "I've been thinking about that. That sounds dangerous. I want to build you one beside the house." Grace's expression changed. Walter caught it. Not because the offer was wrong, because he had almost made the old mistake again. He corrected himself, "No." Grace waited. He took another breath. "I want to help you build one. Better." Grace raised an eyebrow. "And who owns it?" "You. As surely as Red Willow belongs to you?" "As surely." "In writing?" Walter nodded immediately. "In writing." Grace studied him, then looked toward the house. Nellie stood at the kitchen window, her nose almost against the glass. Grace looked back at Walter. "Spring." He blinked. "What?" "I'll stay through spring." Hope moved across his face so quickly it almost hurt to watch. "And you may court me." Walter's shoulders loosened. Grace held up one finger. "Properly." "Yes, ma'am. And if you build that bakery without asking me where the windows go, I will leave. I believe you." She smiled. This time she did not hide it. Ben Hoshin appeared around the wagon. "Stage?" Grace looked at Walter, then at the house. "No." Ben nodded as though he had known all along. "I'll put the wagon away." Months later, spring reached Red Willow slowly. Snow withdrew from the shaded gullies. The creek ran high with meltwater. Calves appeared in the lower pasture. And beside the main house stood a new bakehouse with 2 wide windows, a stone oven, a long work table, and a deed bearing Grace Holloway's name. Walter had built the frame. Grace had chosen every measurement. They argued about the placement of the flower shelves. Grace won. Nellie claimed otherwise. By May, her voice came more easily. Not constantly. Some mornings she still went quiet. No one forced it. One evening, Walter walked toward the bakehouse carrying a repaired gate latch. Before he reached the door, he heard Nellie talking. Not one word. Not 2. A whole story. And then the calf went under the fence, and Ben ran after it. But he slipped by the water trough, and his hat fell off, and the calf stepped right on it. Grace laughed. Walter stopped outside the open door. Flower dust floated in the late sunlight. Nellie sat on an overturned bucket, swinging her boots. Grace stood at the table with both hands in dough, her sleeves rolled up, hair coming loose at the temples. The room was full of warmth, full of bread, full of noise. Grace noticed him. "You planning to stand there all night, Giant?" Nellie turned. "Papa!" Ben lost his hat. "So I've heard." Walter stepped inside. Grace looked at the latch in his hand. "Work?" "Finished. That'll be the day." He set it down. Then he moved beside her. Grace looked up. He did not touch her immediately. He still had that habit. Waiting, Grace wiped one flower-covered hand on her apron and held it out. Walter took it. He bent and kissed her gently. Nellie groaned. "Papa?" Walter straightened. Grace laughed. Nellie laughed too. The sound filled the bakehouse and spilled through the open windows toward the pasture. Walter looked at his daughter, then at Grace. For nearly 2 years, he had thought silence was the price of surviving what his family had lost. He had been wrong. The dead did not ask the living to remain empty. Grief had not left Red Willow Ranch. Sarah's apron still hung upstairs. Her cinnamon jar still sat in its wooden box. There were still cold mornings when Walter remembered the mountain road. Still Sundays when Nellie grew quiet without explanation. But the house had made room for other things. Grace's recipe ledger beside the stove. Nellie's voice at the supper table. A bakery deed with one woman's name on it. A giant cowboy learning that love did not erase what came before. It simply asked whether there was enough courage to make room for what came next. Grace squeezed Walter's hand. "Bread's burning." He looked toward the oven. "It is." "You going to do something?" Walter smiled. "I've learned not to interfere with the baker." Grace bumped him with one flowery elbow, and Red Willow filled with laughter again. Imagine standing where Grace once stood, with your whole life packed into one worn carpet bag, wondering whether being useful to someone was the same as being wanted. Or imagine being Walter, carrying grief so long that silence begins to feel safer than risking your heart again. Neither of them was rescued by some perfect moment. Grace still had scars from being judged. Walter still missed Sarah. Nellie still had quiet days. What healed them came slowly. In warm bread shared at a kitchen table, in apologies that asked for nothing back, in a little girl's returning voice, and in two people finding the courage to choose each other without asking the past to disappear. Maybe that's what second chances really look like. Not forgetting who we lost, not pretending we were never hurt, just making room beside the sorrow for something living. And sometimes love begins there, not with grand promises, but with someone staying long enough to see who you really are, then choosing you when staying is no longer necessary. If you had been Grace that morning beside the wagon, would you have stayed and given Walter another chance? Tell me in the comments. I'd truly like to know. And if stories about wounded hearts, quiet courage, family, mystery, and unexpected love mean something to you, subscribe and stay with us. There are many more stories waiting down the trail.